In the dead of night, HOA tyrant Karen scatters gravel on blind teen Emma's ramp, aiming to break her spirit. But she doesn't know Emma's father is the district commissioner, wielding the power to unravel her reign of cruelty in a battle for justice. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The sound of Emma's white cane scraping against gravel on her accessibility ramp jolted me awake at 5:30 a.m. My 16-year-old daughter never made noise when navigating our front entrance. She had memorized every inch of that ramp since we installed it 2 years ago. The irregular scratching sound meant something was terribly wrong. I threw on clothes and rushed outside to find Emma standing at the bottom of her ramp, tears streaming down her face as her school bag lay scattered across the concrete. Small, sharp stones covered every inch of the smooth surface she relied on for safe navigation to and from our house. "Dad," Emma whispered, her voice breaking with confusion and hurt. "Someone put rocks on my ramp. I can't feel where it's safe to step. Why would someone do this to me?" Emma had been born with Leber congenital amaurosis, a rare genetic condition that left her completely blind from birth. But what she lacked in sight, she made up for in intelligence, determination, and a spirit that could light up any room. At 16, she was already taking college-level courses, played violin in the state youth orchestra, and had dreams of becoming a civil rights lawyer like her mother had been. My wife Sarah had died of cancer 4 years ago, leaving me to raise Emma alone while working as district commissioner. Sarah had been Emma's fiercest advocate, fighting schools, institutions, and anyone who tried to limit our daughter's potential because of her blindness. Before she died, Sarah made me promise to never let anyone make Emma feel less than extraordinary. I knelt beside Emma, my hands shaking with rage as I gathered her scattered textbooks and homework. "It's okay, sweetheart," I managed, though fury burned in my chest. "Daddy's going to fix this." As I carefully guided Emma up our front steps, she knew every inch of our house by heart. I caught sight of Margaret Whitmore watching from her kitchen window across the street. The 60-year-old HOA president stood there with her arms crossed and a satisfied smirk that made my blood boil. Margaret had opposed Emma's ramp from the very beginning. "It's an eyesore that destroys our neighborhood's aesthetic," she had declared at countless HOA meetings. "This is a residential community, not a medical facility. Property values will plummet if we start accommodating every special need." But Margaret had no idea that the quiet single father she'd been tormenting for months was actually District Commissioner James Mitchell, a man who had spent 20 years fighting for justice and had the legal power to destroy her comfortable life. After making sure Emma had breakfast and helping her reorganize her homework, I walked her to the bus stop 3 blocks away. Emma navigated the familiar route with her cane, but I could see how the morning's incident had shaken her confidence. The smooth, reliable ramp had been her symbol of independence. Now someone had turned it into an obstacle course designed to humiliate her. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, met me at her fence as we returned from the bus stop. The elderly woman had witnessed Margaret's late-night vandalism and was finally ready to speak up. "Mr. Mitchell," she whispered in heavily accented English, "I saw her do it. Last night around 11 o'clock. She carried a bucket of gravel from her garage and dumped it all over Emma's ramp. I wanted to stop her, but she scares me. That woman has been making my life hell for 3 years. Would you be willing to testify about what you saw, Mrs. Rodriguez?" Her weathered hands gripped the fence. "That evil woman called immigration on my family last year, even though we've been citizens for 15 years. She reported my grandson for suspicious activity when he was just skateboarding in our driveway. Yes, I will testify against her." By the time I finished cleaning every piece of gravel from Emma's ramp, Margaret had positioned herself on my driveway, wearing her usual expression of smug superiority. She was a woman who had clearly never faced real consequences for her cruelty, and it showed in every entitled gesture. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I trust you understand that this ramp continues to violate our community standards. Perhaps last night's incident will help you see reason about removing this monstrosity." "You vandalized my blind daughter's accessibility ramp," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "You traumatized a 16-year-old girl who has never done anything to hurt you." Margaret examined her perfectly manicured nails with theatrical boredom. "Oh, please, let's not be dramatic. Blind children need to learn that the world won't always accommodate their limitations. There are specialized schools and institutions designed for people with her condition. This neighborhood is for normal families who contribute to property values." The word normal hit me like a physical blow. Sarah had spent Emma's entire life fighting against exactly this kind of ignorance. People who saw disability as something shameful rather than just another way of experiencing the world. My daughter, I said through gritted teeth, is taking college courses at 16, speaks 4 languages fluently and has perfect pitch. She volunteers at the animal shelter, tutors struggling students, and has already been accepted to Harvard's pre-law program. What exactly makes her abnormal? Margaret's laugh was cold and sharp. Mr. Mitchell, let's be realistic. That girl will never be truly independent. She'll always be a burden on society, requiring special accommodations and government assistance. This is a respectable neighborhood for families who enhance property values, not those who drain community resources. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Could you repeat that statement about my daughter being a burden on society? Her eyes narrowed with malicious pleasure. You can't intimidate me with your amateur videos. My husband has been a county administrator for 30 years. I have connections throughout this city that go far beyond your little ramp protest. That eyesore is coming down one way or another. Is that a threat, Mrs. Whitmore? It's a promise. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. I've maintained this neighborhood's standards for 25 years. I won't let some widowed single father and his defective daughter destroy everything we've built here. The word defective echoed in my head long after Margaret strutted back to her house. That evening, as Emma sat at our kitchen table working on calculus homework that would challenge most college seniors, she looked up at me with those beautiful brown eyes that had never seen but somehow always seemed to look right into my soul. Dad, why does Mrs. Whitmore hate me so much? I've never even spoken to her. What did I do wrong? How do you explain pure cruelty to a child who has never harbored hatred toward anyone? How do you tell your brilliant, kind daughter that some people see her blindness as a personal failing rather than just another characteristic like having brown hair or being tall? Some people are afraid of things they don't understand, sweetheart, I said, sitting beside her and helping organize her Braille textbooks. Mrs. Whitmore has probably never known anyone who is blind. Her fear makes her say cruel things. Emma nodded thoughtfully, then surprised me with a question that showed wisdom far beyond her 16 years. Dad, are you going to let her win? Because Mom always said we never let bullies win, no matter how scared they make us feel. No, sweetheart. Daddy's going to make sure Mrs. Whitmore learns that targeting children with disabilities has serious consequences. That night, after Emma went to bed, I made a series of phone calls that would end Margaret Whitmore's reign of terror permanently. But first, I needed to understand exactly how extensive her cruelty had been. Research revealed that Margaret's harassment extended far beyond our family. The Johnson family had been fined repeatedly for their vegetable garden, which Margaret claimed attracted undesirable wildlife and lowered property values. The Martinez family faced constant complaints about their children playing outside, with Margaret calling police for excessive noise whenever their kids laughed too loudly during the day. The elderly Chin family had been tormented for years about their beautiful memorial garden honoring deceased relatives, with Margaret demanding they remove what she called foreign decorations that violated neighborhood aesthetic standards. She had even filed complaints with the city about their traditional Chinese lanterns during Lunar New Year celebrations. But the most disturbing case involved the Henderson family, a young African-American couple with twin toddlers. Margaret had filed dozens of complaints about everything from their music to their guests to their children's toys left in their own yard. She had called police multiple times, claiming suspicious activity when Mr. Henderson worked on his car in his own garage or when Mrs. Henderson had friends over for book club meetings. The pattern was unmistakable. Margaret systematically targeted anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of an acceptable neighbor. Families with disabilities, racial minorities, elderly immigrants, young parents, anyone who threatened her vision of suburban conformity became her enemy. The following week brought annual HOA elections. Margaret had run unopposed for the past 8 years, so confident in her power that she didn't even bother campaigning anymore. What she didn't know was that I had spent the previous days quietly visiting every house in our neighborhood, talking to families who had suffered under her tyranny. Election day arrived with perfect autumn weather. Margaret strolled into the community center at 7 p.m., expecting her usual coronation ceremony. Instead, she found the room packed with neighbors she had bullied, harassed, and intimidated over the years. Her confident smile faltered as she scanned the hostile crowd. I sat quietly in the back corner, watching as Maria Martinez, the elementary school teacher Margaret had targeted for months, stood up to address the packed room. For too long, we've allowed fear to keep us silent, Maria said, her voice carrying clearly through the tense atmosphere. Fear of fines, fear of harassment, fear of becoming Margaret's next target. But when I saw what she did to Emma Mitchell, A child whose only crime was being born blind? I realized our silence makes us all complicit in her cruelty. One by one, neighbors stood to share their stories. Mrs. Chin described in broken English how Margaret had forced her to remove her husband's memorial garden, calling their cultural traditions un-American propaganda. The Hendersons talked about being followed by private security guards Margaret had hired to monitor their suspicious behavior. The Johnsons showed photographs of their modest vegetable garden that Margaret had forced them to destroy, claiming tomatoes and herbs violated community standards. When votes were counted, Margaret had suffered a devastating defeat. Maria Martinez was elected president with 83% of the vote. The first item on the new board's agenda was passing a comprehensive anti-discrimination policy that specifically protected families with disabilities, minorities, and anyone else Margaret had victimized. Margaret's face turned purple with rage. She stormed toward the exit, screaming about election fraud and corruption, promising to have the results overturned through her husband's connections. At the door, she turned back and pointed directly at me with shaking finger. "This isn't over, you pathetic man," she shrieked, her composure completely shattered. "I have connections you can't imagine. That blind freak daughter of yours will regret the day she rolled her disgusting self into my neighborhood. I'll make sure she knows exactly where defective people belong." The room fell completely silent. Calling a blind teenager a defective freak, in front of 60 witnesses was a mistake that would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. 2 days later, my phone rang at dawn. City building inspectors were at my door, claiming they had received anonymous complaints about unpermitted construction on my property. I smiled as I handed them Emma's ramp permits, all properly filed and approved through my own office 18 months earlier. "Commissioner Mitchell?" The lead inspector's face went pale when he recognized my name on the documents. "Sir, we had no idea these complaints involved your family. Obviously someone filed false reports, and we'll be investigating who made these fraudulent claims." "I'm sure you will," I replied calmly. "I assume you're aware that filing false complaints with city offices is a felony that carries serious jail time?" Margaret's harassment campaign escalated dramatically over the following weeks. She called Child Protective Services, claiming Emma was being neglected and that I was an unfit parent. The social worker who investigated was shocked to discover the complaints were completely fabricated. Emma was thriving academically, had close friends, received excellent medical care, and lived in a loving, supportive home. Margaret filed noise complaints about Emma's violin practice, claiming the music violated quiet hour regulations even though Emma only practiced during approved daytime hours. She tried to have our car towed, reporting it as abandoned despite being properly registered and parked in our own driveway. She even called the health department, claiming Emma's guide dog created a public health hazard, though Emma used a cane and had never owned a dog. Each false report was carefully documented, photographed, and added to a growing legal file that would eventually destroy Margaret's comfortable life. She had no idea she was building her own prison, one lie at a time. The breaking point came on a cold December morning. Emma was walking to her friend's house 2 blocks away when Margaret deliberately blocked the sidewalk with her car, forcing Emma to navigate around the vehicle while Margaret watched and laughed. Emma's cane got caught in the car's wheel well, and she fell hard on the concrete, scraping her hands and knees. Mrs. Rodriguez witnessed the entire incident and immediately called me. By the time I arrived, Margaret was standing over Emma, who was sitting on the sidewalk trying not to cry while examining her bleeding palms. "Maybe now she'll learn to stay where she belongs," Margaret sneered as I helped Emma to her feet. "Blind people shouldn't be wandering around normal neighborhoods without supervision. This is what happens when defective children think they can function like everyone else." Emma heard every cruel word. I watched my brilliant, confident daughter's face crumble as 16 years of carefully built self-esteem shattered in a moment of pure malice. That was the instant Margaret Whitmore's life as she knew it ended, though she had no idea what was coming. I made 5 phone calls that evening. The first went to District Attorney Sarah Chin, no relation to our neighbor, who immediately opened a criminal investigation into Margaret's pattern of harassment, discrimination, and filing false police reports. The second call went to the State Commission for the Blind, whose lawyers were very interested in a case involving systematic harassment of a disabled minor. The third went to the Federal Civil Rights Division, which handles disability discrimination cases. The fourth call went to the County Corruption Task Force, because my investigation had revealed that Margaret's husband, Robert Whitmore, had been using his position as a county administrator to access confidential records about families Margaret targeted. Tax information, medical records, background checks. He had been feeding his wife private government data to help her harassment campaigns. But I saved the most devastating call for last. The FBI's Public Corruption Unit was very interested in Robert's abuse of his government position and the systematic civil rights violations his wife had been committing with his help. The morning federal agents arrested Margaret for criminal harassment and hate crimes while simultaneously arresting Robert for public corruption. Emma and I were having breakfast on our front porch. We listened as Margaret screamed denials and threats while FBI agents led her away in handcuffs. "Dad," Emma said quietly, her hand finding mine with the precision that came from years of navigating by touch. "Is it really over? Can she hurt me anymore?" "The legal part is just beginning, sweetheart. But no, she can never hurt you again." Margaret's trial became the biggest news story our county had seen in years. Local television stations ran daily coverage as the evidence of her systematic harassment campaign was presented to a horrified jury. Dozens of families testified about years of discrimination, intimidation, and abuse targeting anyone Margaret deemed unacceptable. The recordings I had made of her calling Emma defective and a burden on society played on every news station in the state. Video footage from neighbors' security cameras showed Margaret deliberately blocking sidewalks to trip Emma, vandalizing our ramp, and screaming slurs at our house during late-night harassment sessions. But the most powerful moment came when Emma testified. Sitting calmly at the witness stand, her white cane resting against her chair, she spoke about her dreams of becoming a civil rights lawyer, her academic achievements, her volunteer work with children who had disabilities, and her determination to ensure no other child ever faced the kind of systematic cruelty Margaret had inflicted. "Mrs. Whitmore tried to convince me that being blind made me less valuable than other people," Emma said, her voice steady and clear despite her youth. "She wanted me to believe I was defective, that I didn't deserve to live in her neighborhood or dream about my future. But she taught me something important about the difference between disability and inability." The courtroom was completely silent as Emma continued. "I can't see, but I can hear the fear in a bully's voice when they realize their victim won't be intimidated. I can't see, but I can feel the warmth of a community that chooses kindness over cruelty. I can't see Mrs. Whitmore's face, but I can sense the emptiness inside someone who finds pleasure in hurting children." Emma paused, turning her head toward where Margaret sat at the defendant's table. "I feel sorry for Mrs. Whitmore. She must live in a very dark world if the only way she can feel good about herself is by trying to destroy a teenager's confidence. I hope prison gives her time to find some light in her life, because everyone deserves a chance to become better than they are." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even Margaret's own lawyer was visibly moved by Emma's compassion for the woman who had tormented her. Margaret received 4 years in federal prison for hate crimes, criminal harassment, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Robert got 8 years for public corruption, abuse of office, and using government resources to facilitate his wife's crimes. They lost their house to legal fees, were forced to declare bankruptcy, and became pariahs in the community they had once terrorized. 6 months after Margaret's conviction, our neighborhood had transformed completely. The new HOA board, led by Maria Martinez, passed comprehensive anti-discrimination policies and created a community fund to help families install accessibility features. 3 more houses added ramps for elderly residents, and the community garden bloomed with vegetables and flowers representing the diverse cultures Margaret had tried to suppress. Emma started a peer support group for teenagers with disabilities, meeting every weekend in our living room. She learned advanced Braille technology to help visually impaired students access better educational resources. She studied disability law and began writing articles for advocacy magazines about the legal rights of students with disabilities. The ramp Margaret had tried to destroy became a symbol that attracted national attention. Families from across the country reached out to share their own stories of housing discrimination and ask for guidance. Together with Maria Martinez and our neighbors, Emma and I created a legal foundation that provides free advocacy for families facing disability discrimination. Emma's story spread through social media, inspiring thousands of young people with disabilities to fight for their rights and refuse to accept limitations others tried to impose on them. She received speaking invitations from schools, disability organizations, and civil rights groups across the nation. One evening, as Emma practiced violin, her fingers finding each note with the same precision she brought to everything else in her life, she stopped mid-song and looked toward where I was reading on the couch. "Dad, do you think Mrs. Whitmore has learned anything in prison? Do you think she understands now how wrong she was?" I considered the question carefully. Reports from the Federal Correctional Facility indicated Margaret was struggling to adapt to prison life, where her wealth and connections meant nothing and where many inmates had family members with disabilities. "I hope so, sweetheart. But more importantly, Look at what you've accomplished because of what she put you through. Emma's face lit up with that brilliant smile that had been melting hearts since she was a baby. She gestured toward our transformed neighborhood, where children of all backgrounds played together without fear, where elderly immigrants tended gardens celebrating their heritage, and where accessibility had become a point of community pride rather than controversy. Sometimes, Emma said thoughtfully, the worst things people do to us become the foundation for the best things we do for others. Mom used to say that every injustice is an opportunity to create more justice in the world. My 16-year-old daughter had just articulated something that had taken me decades to understand through my work as district commissioner. True justice isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation, healing, and ensuring the same harm never happens to anyone else. As I tucked Emma into bed that night, a ritual we had maintained since she was small, even though she was now taller than her mother had been, she made a request that brought tears to my eyes. Dad, when Mrs. Whitmore gets out of prison, can we send her one of my articles about disability rights? Not to be mean but to show her what she helped me become? Maybe if she sees how her cruelty turned into something positive, she'll understand that hurting people never makes anyone stronger. That's when I knew that despite everything Margaret Whitmore had tried to break in my daughter, she had failed completely. Emma's spirit wasn't just unbroken, it had become a beacon of hope for thousands of families facing similar struggles. The next morning I found Emma at her computer, using voice recognition software to write what would become her first published article in a national civil rights magazine. The piece was titled, "Seeing Justice: How One Bully's Cruelty Became My Calling." "What are you writing about, sweetheart?" Emma's fingers paused over her braille keyboard as she smiled. "I'm writing about how Mrs. Whitmore accidentally gave me the greatest gift of my life, the knowledge that I'm strong enough to face anything and help other people find their strength too." I realized then that my daughter had accomplished something I never could have achieved through legal channels alone. She had transformed an enemy into an unwitting teacher, hatred into wisdom, and her own pain into a healing force that would protect countless other children. Margaret Whitmore had set out to break a blind girl who dared to live confidently in her neighborhood. Instead, she had helped create a young advocate who would spend her life ensuring no child with a disability ever felt broken again. That ramp she had covered with gravel now leads not just to our house, but to a future where every person knows they belong exactly as they are, where accessibility is a community value rather than a burden, and where difference is celebrated rather than feared. Years later, when Emma graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School and was accepted to clerk for a Supreme Court justice who happened to be blind herself, I thought about that terrible morning when I found gravel on her ramp. Sometimes the cruelest moments in our lives become the foundation for our greatest victories. And sometimes, the people who try to tear us down end up lifting us higher than we ever thought possible. Emma's first case as a civil rights lawyer involved representing a family whose autistic son was being denied access to his neighborhood school. As she stood in federal court, arguing passionately for every child's right to be included in their community, I could hear Sarah's voice in every word our daughter spoke. Margaret Whitmore had tried to convince the world that Emma didn't belong. Instead, she had helped Emma discover exactly where she belonged, at the forefront of the fight for justice, using her brilliant mind and unbreakable spirit to create a world where no child would ever face the cruelty Margaret had inflicted. The gravel is long gone. The ramp remains. And Emma continues to climb higher every single day.